Hey everybody, it's MotherGoose27 and welcome back to my channel. Today we are finally talking about Warhammer again. I'm so sorry to all of my subs who followed me for my Warhammer content. I just haven't made any content lately and I'm sorry. But that changes today. Today we're going to be continuing our possible but unlikely Total War Warhammer 3 faction series. Specifically, today we are talking about Nippon. This is another faction that I really want to see in the game, like all of the other factions I've talked about. The main reason I haven't talked about Nippon is because there's a ton of videos already out on Nippon, and a lot of what I wanted to do with this series is talk about those really obscure races that not a lot of people, or even in some cases no people, have talked about. But Nippon is a faction that I actually really want to see in the game, and lately we've been getting some evidence against it and maybe some evidence for it. So I thought, let's start with talking about that. Then I'm going to talk about the little official lore that we know about, no speculations as far as I know, and then the army roster. As usual, there will be time codes in the description below if you want to bounce around the video. A lot of what I'm going to talk about in this first section has been talked about in the community a lot, but it's the main reason that I actually wanted to make this video. So first and foremost, we got Cathay. And countless YouTubers have already said this, but I completely agree. I think CA and Games Workshop is using Cathay as a testing ground to see how popular these Eastern factions can be. If you really want to see other factions like Nippon, Ind, Koresh, maybe the Kurgan not looking so good with how large the Eastern Steppes is in the official map, which we're going to be talking about here in a minute. But my whole point is, if you want to actually potentially see these factions and races in the game, play Cathay, be excited about Cathay, talk about Cathay, let CA and Games Workshop know that you're really excited about it, you really like the faction, and you want to see other factions like it. That being said, there was a recent interview done by the Great Book of Grudges and the Lore Master of Sotek with one of the devs for the game, where they mentioned Koresh, which definitely brings hope for both of those factions. If you haven't watched my Snakemen video, it's linked above. But then they kind of mentioned Nippon without mentioning Nippon. They didn't say Nippon specifically, but they said a nation to the east, specifically talking about the Sea Dragon and the Dragon Fleet, how they'd fight, how their main purpose was protecting Cathay on the open seas against pirates, dark elves, and a nation to the east, without specifically mentioning Nippon, which was a little weird. They could have just said Nippon, because they specifically mentioned Ind, and they specifically mentioned Koresh. They are acknowledging these factions, which is really good, which shows that they are on Creative Assembly and Games Workshop's minds, which, if they're on their minds, definitely leads to the possibility of them being in the game. Again, I really think Cathay's a testing ground for it. The next thing I want to talk about is, I could have sworn that there was an interview somewhere where CA said at the moment they didn't have any plans for Ind, Koresh, or Nippon. When I was doing research for this video, I just could not find it. So it might be out there, it might just be a figment of my imagination, but I wanted to mention it if it actually does exist, and I just am dumb and couldn't find it. But if that is the case, and it is real, and I'm not just imagining it, I don't think it completely counts them out for good. I think it's just right now we're focusing on the launch factions and the factions we have planned currently for DLC, but I don't think it's a total they're not happening in the game at all. But again, I couldn't find the actual interview or any reference to it anywhere. The last thing I want to talk about is the map. Like many of you, I'm really disappointed with the map overall. They really squished down Cathay. The Eastern Steppes is so small. It is so small. Why? Which really hurts the chances for factions like the Hobgoblins and the Kurgan. Again, I did not have much hope for the Kurgan. If we see them, they'll probably be an addition to another faction, maybe a Chaos Warrior update. But the Hobgoblins were a faction I definitely could see them adding to the game at some point. But again, with the Eastern Steppes being so small, maybe not. But what we don't see is the eastern part of Cathay, which again, a lot of people are really said about, and a chunk of the southern part, which then excludes Ind, Koresh, and because we don't have the eastern part, Nippon. Does this mean they're completely counted out from the game? No. It just means in the starting map, they are not on there. There's definitely a chance that this is just the available part of the map, but then there's going to be a lot of fogged out area that they are going to unfog and reveal more sections of the map later, or they're just going to make the map larger and add more areas. Even if we don't, in the end, get Nippon, in Koresh, any of those factions, I definitely do think by the end of Total War Warhammer 3's lifespan that the map is going to be a lot larger. For example, we were talking about the Sea Dragon and the Dragon Fleet. They protect the eastern part of Cathay. They have specifically mentioned it when talking about all the new lore they've done for Cathay, and I don't think they'd put that much effort into creating that lore if they didn't at least have some plans of expanding the map. Going along with that, they've also talked about the Monkey King and the Mountains of Heaven, and yet the Mountains of Heaven just aren't on the map. I'm pretty confident that they are going to expand the map, at least some. Does this mean necessarily that they will add Nippon, Ind, and Koresh even as just playable areas without adding the factions? No. But I definitely think we'd be wrong to look at the map we have now and say that's going to be the same exact map we have at the end of Total War Warhammer 3's lifespan. All of that being said, I don't think Nippon is off the table. I definitely believe there is a chance for them to add this faction at some point in the lifespan of the game. Azula, you're a cutie.
Why have you forsaken me, father?
Okay, let's talk about some actual lore. There isn't really a lot of lore around Nippon, but while doing research for the video, there was a lot more than I actually expected there to be. So, what you need to know about Nippon. Nippon is an island east of Cathay, and it is led by a stern feudal lord system, which leaves Nippon as a somewhat divided empire where different lords are constantly fighting for power. What I didn't know is that they actually do have an emperor who goes by the Divine Sun. I couldn't find a lot of information on the Divine Sun, but he's known as a reclusive, semi-divine emperor, so maybe not as powerful as, say, Cathay's Dragon Emperor, but maybe more powerful than Karl Franz, possibly. But he doesn't really control Nippon. While he is the emperor, it is the samurai warlords who really control the country. Each group controls a small section. They're constantly having private wars against one another. And the emperor and his empire are not strong enough to actually control each of the different feudal lords. Something I find really interesting about Nippon is that while they are a very private country and they don't often let outsiders in, there are a lot of instances of their samurai actually leaving Nippon and serving other countries. Either this is they were out at sea, they got hit by a typhoon, and landed on the shores of another country where they went and offered their service to whatever king, emperor, cult leader there was. But there were also instances where they just decided, I'm not happy being here, I'm out, and they willingly leave and go serve other nations, which I think could be a really interesting mechanic if they actually did add Nippon to Total War Warhammer 3. We could potentially have it as a mercenary mechanic where you could hire samurai to fight for you. I think that would be really cool. Nippon is also the home and birthplace of ninjas. There are several groups of ninja assassins within the country, and they also were the ones who taught Clan Eshin how to be assassins. There are also several diverse orders of monks, and they are split into really two categories, either martial or clerical, which could be really cool to see in-game. In terms of religion, again, something I didn't know before researching for this video is they serve a deity called the Orange Simka, which there's really not much information about it. When I went to go do research on it, all I could find was that the people of Nippon worship it. There might be some other information out there that I just haven't found, but that's all I could find at the moment. But when talking about Nippon, a lot of people talk about the temple dogs, and this is where they actually come into use. They guard the temples of the Orange Simka. Orange Simka. I think I've been pronouncing it wrong. There are some Nipponese who worship Tzeentch, which is just another name for Lord Tzeentch. So we do see some Tzeentch worship within Nippon as well. In terms of other nations, they've had several run-ins with the Dark Elves, specifically, and something we could see in the game. We know they taught Clan Eshin how to be assassins. There's trade with Marienburg and several Nipponese characters who actually live in Marienburg, which I'll talk about here in a little bit. There's some trade with the High Elves, which, of course, they're sea traders. And last but not least, there's Cathay, which we've already talked about a little bit, which we've seen a lot of conflict between the two nations. I'm going to read an excerpt from the wiki page just describing the samurai warriors and how strong they actually are. The might of the island race of Nippon is considered a threat, even in the eyes of the great emperor of Cathay, as it is a notable sea power. Again, as we mentioned before, the Dragon Fleet and the Sea Dragon, specifically defending the seas of Cathay against pirates, Dark Elves, and Nippon, who has a powerful fleet. In Nippon, the samurai have developed their skills to a level far above those of normal humans. So while it is a country much smaller than Cathay, they are still incredibly powerful due to just how strong their samurai are. In terms of the monks, though, again, reading from the wiki, even these warriors, the samurai, are outclassed by the various orders of warrior monks. And then in regards to their ninja assassins are indispensable members for a samurai lord, dark agents of death who prey upon unwary and slay them without mercy. So there's not really a lot of lore surrounding them, but it's very specific on just how powerful they really are. I think the last thing you really need to know about Nippon is that they do have gunpowder weapons. The samurai, though, refuse to use them, viewing them as inferior weapons. Not only just inferior, but they view them as cowardly weapons. And so a lot of the Nippon military is actually built up of peasants who will actually wield these weapons to assist the samurai in battle. We've talked about the actual land, how it's ruled, the religion, and some of the people within it. But let's actually move to talking about specific units. In terms of heroes, there is a bombardier who controls and shoots the cannons. We would have different samurai lords. We would have the monks. We could see martial monk, but then specifically there is the Vim 2 mage, which is just a powerful class of monks. It's not specifically mentioned, but we could also see a ninja assassin as a hero as well. In terms of actual units, there is the Ashigaru, which is the peasant class. They would make up a lot of the lower tier units from infantry to long range. They wield swords, spears, handguns, bows, crossbows, handguns, like I mentioned before. Really, the Ashigaru would make up a large section of the military, but filling a lot of different roles. Again, these would be the low tier units. Specifically in terms of the Ashigaru, even though they are peasants, I did want to read this as well. Nipponese peasants are extremely reluctant to fight for samurai overlords. However, sometimes they have no choice. They form regiments of Ashigaru, highly disciplined warriors that follow the samurai and obey them without question. So even though they are peasants, the phrasing of this makes me think that they would be a lot more powerful than, say, the Bretonnia peasants, and they'd serve a lot of different roles. But then we could have units of ninja assassins. We could potentially see a low and high tier version. Then, of course, we have our warrior monks, again broken up into martial and cleric classes. Then, of course, there are the samurai, which would make up the medium to high tier units. I could see them having just like normal weapons and great weapons. They would be melee infantry, cavalry, archers, crossbowmen, great weapons. There's a lot of variety you could do with the samurai. They serve a lot of different roles. Again, the only thing they refuse to do would be to wield anything with gunpowder. Again, they view it as a cowardly weapon. In terms of cavalry, the Ashigaru would fill low-tier cavalry, while the samurai would fill the high-tier cavalry role. In terms of artillery, they have bolt throwers, cannons, rocket launchers, and stone throwers, which are basically catapults. But I wanted to read a little excerpt specifically about their cannons. Okay, so they have very precise 6 to 9 foot long war rockets filled with a mixture of fireworks that are designed to frighten, disorganize, and distract the fires of the hit, which I think would just be a really unique mechanic. It may not deal as much damage, but if it can disorient the enemy, it could still be very useful. And then in terms of monsters, it's said that they will hire ogre and giant mercenaries, which, I mean, I think would just be a given now with the ogre mercenary mechanic that we have. But then they have the temple dogs, which I mentioned earlier, which we could see as its own specific unit. We could see them as a high tier monstrous cavalry unit, and we could see them as mounts for heroes and legendary lords. It is said that it is an extremely high honor to actually be able to ride one of the temple dogs. Then lastly, there is the Ki-Rin, and I'm just going to read a little excerpt about them. According to the sages of Cathay, the race of Ki-Rin was born of the union of air and earth when the world was young. Ki-Rin are aerial creatures that ride the roaring winds and storm clouds, bellowing like thunder and screaming great cracks of lightning through the disturbed air. This is a really unique unit. It's like a flying electric wind unicorn horse creature. It's really, really cool. Again, we could see its own unit, we could see them as a cavalry unit, and we could see them again as mounts for heroes and legendary lords. In terms of units, that's really it. We do have some notable characters that I'm going to mention. None of these really stick out to me. I feel like most likely, just with Cathay, they would create their own legendary lords for it. And the main reason I'm saying this is a lot of them don't really seem to be around during the time of when Total War Warhammer 3 takes place. Like Sanyo Kowalski? I butchered that name, but it specifically says the tale of Sanyo Kowalski is typical of those stories honored such by the samurai caste of Nippon. Sayano was a samurai lord who disagreed with the government. He viewed them as lazy, they were too liberal, and he just really disagreed with a lot of the things they were doing. But things really came to a head when a ship was seen off the western coast and the government did nothing to sink the ship. Senyo got angry, built an army, and attacked the capital. The siege didn't end up being a success, and he committed ritual suicide. He's a really interesting character where most of the named characters actually revolve around him. Nissan, Fujima, Nagajima, Itachi, Honda, Suzuki, Sansui Lee. Yeah, all of these characters either fought with Sanyo, I'm sorry I'm butchering it, or they were companions of one of Sanyo's companions, which just means by the time, I don't have an exact date of when this battle actually takes place, but it seems like they're all dead. But most likely they are all dead, which most likely means they wouldn't be candidates for the game. That doesn't necessarily mean they wouldn't be. There's always a possibility, but most likely we're going to see original legendary lords. There are a couple. There's Nito. It said that he was an aged but wise Vito mage who did not need weapons to defend himself. And then there's a couple here. There's Lady Katsuki and Toko, both Nippon characters, but both lived in Marienburg. So again, probably wouldn't be candidates. Anyway, there was a lot more to Nippon than I thought there would be. And when looking at the actual units, they really have everything they need for a fleshed out army. A lot of the roles would be split between the Ashigaru and the samurai, serving a lot of similar roles, but the low to high tier versions. But then we'd also see the ninja assassins and the monks filling different roles between heroes and units. And then with their monsters and the mercenaries that they hire, it is a honestly pretty fleshed out army. Really, they would just need some notable legendary lords and maybe a little more variety in monstrous units, but really everything else is taken care of. In terms of, like, actually, what I'm trying to say is in terms of the actual building the army, all the pieces are there. It would just mostly be fleshing out the lore and making it fit, making the world feel lived in. Anyway, that's all for today. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to join the flock, and I will see you in the next one. Mother Goose out.